After one of the big snowstorms we've had lately, I ran into an acquaintance of mine as I was walking into Walmart, as he was walking out. And although it was still very cold, it happened to be a clear, sunny day. And so by way of greeting, as we were passing each other, I said something about what a beautiful day it was, and he enthusiastically agreed. And then he added, "I went snowshoeing yesterday." And as I was shopping in Walmart, it occurred to me that here was an individual who didn't regard big snowfalls as a pain in the neck the way I do, by and large. He actually welcomed the snow. He regarded it as an opportunity, not an obstacle, as a cup half full versus a cup half empty. That got me to thinking about people who acknowledge and accept the reality of whatever situation they find themselves in and adapt themselves to that reality, as opposed to those who refuse to acknowledge and accept it and thereby deprive themselves of whatever blessings that reality has to offer them. Here's another example. I read an article about the invasion of Asian carp that's apparently become one of those seemingly good ideas that went very wrong. They were introduced in the 70s, I guess, to southern catfish farms in order to eat the overgrowth of algae. But somehow some of them escaped and made their way into the public water system. And steadily, since that time, the fish have climbed their way north, eating as they go, consuming 40% of their body weight every day, according to the article. They not only eat continuously, but they apparently reproduce prodigiously. And so, according to the article, they already inhabit a third of the rivers in the Mississippi and Ohio drainage. And they have been sighted nearing Lake Michigan. And wherever they've gone, they've generally been regarded as a nuisance and a threat. Now, that's a serious problem, isn't it? Environmentalists and others who are attached to the native species are tearing their hair out about it. But it's reality. Whether you like it or not, those Asian carp are there. They're out there. And they're not going away anytime soon. You can't even eat them, right? Because carp, we all know, is a bony, nasty-tasting fish. Wrong. Here's another passage. Here's a passage from the same article that I read about these carp. The Asian carp fillets are as good as anything you can find in the water. Duane Chapman, research biologist at the Invasive Carp Research Program, U.S. Geologic Service, said of cooking the carp, we usually put some rub on it and stick it on the grill and eat it that way. Sometimes we make ceviche, or we'll fry it up for company. You can make fajitas with the carp, or smoke it, add it to the curry or soup, or just steam it. It's delicious. So there's another example of two different ways of dealing with reality. You can deny it or resent it, or you can accept it for what it is and seek to take what it has to offer. And on a more serious note, having worked in hospice for many years, I've become very familiar with the contrast between the way some people deny and resist the reality of their situation while others accept it and seek to find meaning in it, seek to adjust their appreciation to the special experiences that this particular final stage of life provides, just as one suspects they had done to all the earlier stages of their lives. I've gone on about this at some length because I think it might introduce us to a different way of understanding the message of our gospel reading for this morning, a way that we've touched on many times before in thinking about both the nature of the life that Jesus taught us to lead and the reasons why it is not only the way, but also the truth and the life. So let's read this passage together. This is from the 6th chapter of Luke's Gospel, and we'll be reading verses 27 through 38, which comes out of what is essentially Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount. But I say to you, Jesus speaking, obviously, but I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who spitefully use you. To him who strikes you on one cheek, offer the other also, and from him who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who asks of you, and from him who takes away your goods, do not ask them back. And just as you want men to do to you, you also do to them likewise. But if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive back, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much back. But love your enemies, do good and lend, hoping for nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. For he is kind to the unthankful and evil. Therefore, be merciful, just as your Father also is merciful. Judge not, and you shall not be judged. Condemn not, and you shall not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be put into your bosom. For with the same measure that you use, it will be measured back to you. When you read this passage, one thing you might notice is that it seems to have almost separate sections. The first 5 verses are basically a list of things to do. Love your enemies, do good to those who hurt you, turn the other cheek, give to those who ask you, and so on and so on. They are simple instructions with no explanation or attempt to justify them. Then there are 3 verses where Jesus says, look, what I've just told you to do runs contrary to your natural instincts, to your ordinary human nature. But if you follow your natural instincts, you're just like everybody else. Everybody likes people who are nice to them. Everyone loves the members of their family who love them back. Everybody's willing to give something to somebody else if they know they're going to get it back, preferably with interest. But now, suppose you're listening to Jesus, and he got this far, and you decide to interrupt him. You raise your hand. Teacher, I get that what you're telling me to do goes against my grain, loving your enemies and so forth. I get that. But here's what I want to know. If it runs against the grain, if it's so unnatural, if it's so contrary to my feelings and my emotions and my usual way of thinking about things, why should I do them? What's in it for me? Wouldn't that be a natural thing to ask? I think it's a perfectly natural thing to ask, and apparently Jesus thought so also, because the very next verses supply his answer to those questions. But what's especially interesting is the answer he gives. The reason he supplies for why people should engage in this highly unnatural behavior. Let's read the relevant verses again. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great. You will be children of the Most High. For he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. That's the reason. So that you will be children of God. So that you will be as God is, like God. Why should I be kind to the ungrateful? Because I'll get some great reward later on? Because they will be encouraged to have a change of heart? No. Because your Father is. He makes the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. That's what he is. That's what he does. Why should I be merciful? Because it pays in the end? Because someone else will make sure he gets what's coming to him? No. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. And if you think about it, isn't that an amazing answer? We are to behave the way Jesus teaches, the way Jesus instructs, not because we expect to get anything for behaving that way, but simply because that's the way God behaves. And I think that's really the key to understanding the program Jesus came down from heaven to teach us. Following Christ is not a way to get stuff. It's a way of changing who we are. And more than that, it's a way of changing who we are in order to bring our nature into accord with who God is. That's it. Case closed. End of the argument. I lift weights 3 or 4 times a week, and I've done so for many years now. The training program I followed for most of those years is very simple. You only do 4 different lifts, each of them involving a barbell. The squat, the overhead press, the bench press, and the deadlift. Nothing else nothing fancy. You just do those same lifts each time you come to the gym. The only difference is that you keep adding weight to the barbell. Each time you add just a little more weight than you had the last time. It doesn't have to be much, and after a while, as you start to approach your genetic limits, you add them more slowly, and they sometimes become very small additions. But the important thing is that you're always headed in one direction towards heavier and heavier weights. The point of this illustration is that in training to lift heavier and heavier weights, there's really no reward except being able to lift heavier weight. The reward is simply becoming stronger. It's like the old adage, the path doesn't get easier because it flattens out as you climb a mountain. It gets easier because you're becoming stronger. When Jesus instructs us to love our enemies, to turn the other cheek, to forgive 70 times 7, and so on, he's not saying to do those things because there is something over and above those things that will constitute our reward. They're not the price we have to pay to get something else later on, like nasty tasting medicine. He's saying practice them, work on them, because in so doing, you will begin the process of becoming like your Father who art in heaven. The reward in heaven of being merciful and generous and forgiving is not something over and above those simple actions. And I think that's a great mistake people sometimes make in resolving to be good Christians. Being a good Christian doesn't mean that you can immediately find in your power and your heart to forgive the father who abused you, or to love those who hate you. That would be like asking someone to run a 4-minute mile the first time he steps on the track. Following Christ is not being Christ. Following Christ, as Paul tells us, is being gradually transformed into the image of Christ. And that brings us all the way back to where we started. Remember how Jesus, in his final conversation with his disciples, as recorded by John in his gospel, Jesus basically says, if you love me, do what I'm telling you to do. Follow my commandments. Take my instruction seriously. Incorporate it into your own actual everyday lives. He doesn't say, think like I do, feel like I do, be who I am. He says, do what I do. Follow my commandments to do what I do. And now we know why this was his central instruction. Because by imitating him, by following his example, by doing what he does, we gradually become more and more like him. And therefore, more and more like God. And why is that good advice? Because we will be spending eternity with God, in the place God dwells, surrounded by and experiencing those things, and only those things that are of God and in God. The extent and the degree to which we are comfortable there will depend on the extent and the degree to which we have adjusted our lives here to the reality of God, to what heaven has to offer. Like my friend who welcomes the reality of snow by gleefully pulling his snowshoes out of the closet, like the biologist who smacks his lips in anticipation of supper when he pulls a nasty carp out of the river, or maybe even like the gray-haired old geezer picking up and holding a barbell over his head. Like all these folks dealing with their human environment, those of us who will enter heaven after a life of trying to follow Christ, of doing what Christ does, will be much better adapted to what heaven has to offer than those who have chosen to follow the ways of the world. It has even been suggested by some people much wiser than I am that those who have chosen, who have adapted themselves, who have limited themselves to following the ways of the world, to them, once they get into heaven, it will seem like hell. And so our prayer for this morning, Father, is that you help us to begin the slow, steady, and never-ending process of becoming like Christ. Help us to forgive the little things as good practice for forgiving the big things. Help us to resist petty jealousies and petty resentments, so that in time resentment and jealousy wither and die in us altogether from lack of exercise. Help us to find satisfaction in giving away pennies, so that eventually we may find satisfaction in giving away our whole lives, because that's what Jesus did for us. And we are praying in his name. Amen.